Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today our subject is contemporary issues and trends in education. Its code is 381. It's lecture number 4 and the topic of today is education in different periods and societies. Today we will discuss about introduction, then we will discuss about history of education, and then past education system, and then we will discuss about the difference between education in the past and present. In introduction, first of all, if I put questions, where did education start in the world? So students, the idea began to spread that childhood should be a time for learning and schools for children were developed as places of learning. The idea and practice of universal compulsory public education developed gradually in Europe from the early 16th century on into the 19th. So the next is, when was education started? So dear students, in the United States the first schools began in the 13 original colonies in the 17th century. For example, Boston Latin Schools, which was founded in 1635 AD, was the first public school and the oldest existing schools in the country. So the earliest schools focused on reading, writing and mathematics. Okay, the next one is that how was education in 16th century, or sorry, 1600? So in the south, public schools were not common during in 1600 and the earliest 1700. Affluent families paid private tutors to educate their children. These schools educated students of all ages in one room with one teacher. So students did not attend these schools for free. Then what is importance of history of education? Why do we study the history? So the history of anything is important because when your job is to improve the future, and the learning of history of education will help you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of previous endeavors and various educational philosophies. So many of these things you would not know if you didn't study the history of education. So who started education system in the world? So the students, Horikman, he was the person. This credit goes to this man. This credit for our modern vision of school system usually goes to Horikman. So when he became Secretary of Education in Massachusetts in 1837, he set forth his vision for a system of professional teachers who would teach students an organized curriculum of basic content. And who is father of education? So the father of education is called Horikman. Horikman was born on May 4th, 1796 in Franklin, Massachusetts. His father was a farmer without much money. Now we will discuss about meaning of education. So what is meaning of education? Education is the process of facilitating learning or the acquisition of knowledge, skills, values, beliefs and habits. So educational methods includes teaching, training, storytelling, discussion and direct research. In most regions, education is compulsory up to the certain age. So what is traditional system of education? Traditional system, also known as back to basics. Conventional education or customary education refers to a long established customs that society traditionally used in schools. How was the education system in the past? In the ancient days, education system changed based on the periods such as Vedic, Brahminical, Muslims, British periods. So in Vedic period, schools were becoming boarding and students were handed over to the teachers. So physical education was compulsory at that period. Now we will discuss about past education system. So what is the difference between education in the past and present? The education in the past and present is different in subjects, teachers, classrooms, students, schools, transportation, and financial supports. The education in the past differs from the education in the present in many aspects. So there were no universities, schools, and teachers. So what are the major differences between traditional and modern societies? We can say that traditional refers to those societies or elements of societies that are small scale, are derived from indigenous and often ancient cultural practices. And modern refers to those practices that relate to the industrial mode of production or the development of large scale, often colonial societies. How has education changed over the year? So the purpose of education has evolved over time. Parents initially used education as child care as they moved off farms and into the industrial work environment. Then it was about capability, teaching, providing skills and abilities that would serve them in later life. Now we will discuss about history of education. So first of all, education in ancient Egypt. So most children in Egypt didn't go to school. Instead, boys learned farming or other trades from their fathers. Girls learned sewing, cooking, and other skills from their mothers. Boys from wealthy families sometimes learned to be scribes. They learned by copying and memorizing, and discipline was so strict. And the teachers beat naughty boys. The boys learned reading and writing and also mathematics. So, in that age, the girls were taught to read and write at home. Then, education in ancient Greek. In ancient Greek, girls learned skills like weaving from their mothers. Many girls also learned to read and write at home, and boys from better off families started school when they were 7. So, boys from rich families were escorted to school by a slave, and the boys learned reading, writing, and arithmetic as well as poetry and music. The Greeks also believed that physical education was very important, so boys did dancing and athletics. In that age, the discipline was severe. In ancient Greek schools, and children were often beaten. In Sparta, children were treated very harshly, and at the age of 7, boys were removed from their families and sent to live in barracks. And they were treated severely to turn them into brave soldiers. They were deliberately kept short of food so they would have to steal, teaching them stealth and cunning. They were wiped for any offense. Spartan girls learned athletics, and dancing, so they would become fit and healthy mothers of more soldiers. Then, what was the education in Rome? In rich Roman families, children were educated at home by a tutor. Other boys and girls went to a primary school called Indus at the age of 7 to learn to read and write and do simple arithmetic. Boys went to secondary school where they would learn geometry, history, literature, and oratory, means the art of public speaking. Teachers were often Greek slaves. The teachers were very strict and they frequently beat the pupils. Children wrote on wax tablets with a pointed bone styles. Adults wrote on a form of paper called papyrus, which was made from the papyrus plot. Then, education in Middle Ages. So, what type of education was there at that time? So, in the Middle Ages, many people were illiterate, but not all. Upper class children were educated, and among the medieval poor, the better educated priests might teach some children to read and write a little. In many towns, there were grammar schools where middle class boys were educated. They got their name because they taught Latin grammar. Boys worked long hours in the grammar schools and discipline was severe. So, boys were beaten with rods or bitch twigs. So, there were also chauntry schools. Some men left money in their wills to pay for a priest to chant prayers for their soul after their death. When he was not praying, the priest would educate local children. So during the Middle Ages, education gradually became more common. By the 15th century, perhaps a third of the population of England could read and write. Then, from the early 13th century, England had two universities at Oxford and Cambridge. At them, students learned seven subjects, and those subjects were grammar, rhetoric, means the art of public speaking, then logic, astronomy, mathematics, music, and geometry. Then, education in 16th century England. Education flourished in the 16th century. Many rich men founded grammar schools. Boys usually went to a kind of nursery schools called petty schools. First, then moved on to grammar schools when they were about 7. So the school's day began at 6 a.m. in summer and 7 a.m. in winter. So people went to bed early and got up early in those days. So lunch was from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. School finished at about 5 p.m. Boys went to school 6 days a week and there were few holidays. In the 16th century, many children learned to read and write with something called a hornbook. It was not a book in the modern sense. Instead, it was a wooden board with a handle. Fixed to the board, that was a sheet of paper with the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer written on it. The paper was usually protected by a thin slice of animal horn. Discipline in Tudor schools was savage. The teacher often had a stick with birch twigs attached to it, and boys were hit with the birch twigs on their bare buttocks. At about 15 or 16, the brightest boys might go to one of the England's two universities, Oxford and Cambridge. So, of course, many Tudor boys didn't go to schools at all. If they were lucky, they might get a 7 year apprenticeship and learn a trade. So, some craftsmen could read and write, but few laborers could. As for girls in a rich family, a tutor usually taught them at home In the middle class family, their mother might teach them. Then education in 17th century. So there was a little change in education in the 17th century. In well-off families, both boys and girls went to form of infant schools called a petty school. However, only boys went to a grammar schools, upper class girls and sometimes boys also were taught by tutors. Middle class girls might be taught by their mothers. So there were also dam schools, usually run by a woman, where young girls were taught skills like reading and writing. During the 17th century, boarding schools for girls were founded in many towns. In them, girls were taught subjects like writing, music, and needlework. Then, education in 18th century. In the 18th century, young boys and girls continued to go to dam schools. In the early 18th century, charity schools were founded in many English towns. They were sometimes called blue coats schools because of color of the children's uniform. And boys from well-off families went to grammar schools. Girls from well-off families also went to the school, but it was left important for them to learn accomplishments like embroidery and music rather than academic subjects. Meanwhile, non-conformists or dissenters were not allowed to attend most public schools. Instead, they went to their own dissenting academies. Then, education in the 19th century in England. So, in the 19th century, education that was greatly improved for both boys and girls. So, in the early 19th century, there were still dam schools for every young child. They were run by women who taught a little reading, writing, and arithmetic. However, many dame schools were really a child minding service. So, nevertheless, in the 19th century, Friedrich Froebel and Maria Montessori invented more progressive methods of educating infants. Girls from upper class families were taught by governesses. Boys were often sent to public schools like Eton. In Victorian public schools, boys were taught the classics like Latin but little else. So, science and technical subjects were neglected at that time. Public schools also placed a great emphasis on character building through sports and games. Middle class boys went to grammar schools, and middle class girls went to private schools where they were taught accomplishments such as music and swimming. So, at the beginning of 19th century, a man named Joseph Lancaster invented a new method of educating a working class. In Lancaster's system, the ablest pupils were made monitors and they were put in charge of other pupils. The monitors were taught early in the day before the other children arrived. When they did, the monitors taught them. Then in 1811, the National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor and the Principle of the Established Church was formed. So its schools were called national schools. Then in 1814, non-conformist Protestants who didn't belong to the Church of England formed the British and Foreign School Society. Then in Britain, the state didn't take responsibility for education until 1870. So Foster's Education Act laid down that schools should be provided for all children. So if there were not enough places in existing schools when board schools were built. In 1880, then schools were made compulsory for 5 to 10 years old. However, the schools were not free except for the poorest children until 1891 when fees were abolished. Then from 1899, children were required to go to schools until they were 12. So meanwhile, in the USA, Three women gained bachelor degrees from Oberlin College in 1841. They were the first American women to gain bachelor degrees. The first woman in the USA to gain a PhD was Helen Megal White in 1877. And in Britain, women were first awarded degrees in 1880. Then education in the 20th century. Education vastly improved during the 20th century. In 1900, children sometimes left schools when they were only 12 years old. However, in 1980, the minimum school leaving age was raised to 14. So between the working class children went to elementary schools, and the middle class children went to grammar schools, and upper class children went to public schools. Then in 1948, the school's leaving age was raised to 15, and in 1973 it was raised to 16. So, following the 1944 Education Act, all children had to sit an exams called the 11 plus, and those who passed went to grammar schools, while those who failed went to secondary modern schools. However, in the late 1950, the public opinion began to turn against the system, and in the 1960 and early 1970, most schools became comprehensiveness. Until the late 20th century, teachers were allowed to hit children. However, corporal punishment was phased out in the most primary schools in 1970. The cane was abolished in state secondary schools in 1987. So it was finally abolished in the private schools in 1999. So there was a huge expansion of higher education in the 1960s, and many new universities were founded. Then in 1992, polytechnics were changed to universities. Meanwhile, the Open University began in 1969, and in the late 20th century, people had far more opportunities for education and training than ever before. However, the students' grants were ended in 1998, and the most students now have to take loans. So this was all about today, our discussions. Thank you very much. Take care. Allah Hafiz.